Thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Here's what we're looking at. Heather Sharon gives us a rundown of what's in the mayor's transition report.
A look at how Chicago handles major flooding.
We just want her to be held accountable.
Former employees of Aurora Mayor Richard Irvin's girlfriend claim she stiffed them out of weeks of pay.
And Goodman Theatre reimagines the stage version of the Tony Award-winning musical The Who's Tommy.
But first, here's what's happening in Chicago tonight. Local and national civil rights leaders are coming to the defense of a Chicago public school principal who was fired from Lindblom Math and Science Academy. They say former principal Abdul Muhammad was fired because what they call a questionable investigation from CPS and CTU. Muhammad was removed back in March after CPS said an investigation had substantiated allegations against him, although the specifics have not been made public. National Civil Rights Attorney Ben Crump, who was instrumental in the George Floyd case, says the firing fits a pattern of CPS terminating black principals.
If it happens once, it's an incident.
Right.
It happens twice, it's a coincidence. But when it happens 3 times, 4 times,
Right.
5 times, 6 times, 7 times, it is a pattern in practice of discrimination against black principals.
Drivers whose cars were wrongfully ticketed by the city could be in for a refund if lawyers are successful in court. Local attorneys say last week a judge certified a class action case against the city for violating its own municipal code against ticketing fines and penalties over $250 for standing, parking, or compliance violations. The group is asking a judge to order the city to refund what they believe to be illegal fines and penalties to the residents impacted.
Because we have the case now certified as a class action, that's going to be refunds for everyone who was impacted, which could potentially be in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Seniors on the city's west side are calling for more help recovering from recent storms and flooding. State Representative LaShawn Ford says his office continues to receive calls from older residents asking for assistance.
I've been without hot water for a week. We need to get hot water tanks. We need people that know how to fix these hot water tanks to come and support with supplies so that people could get hot water. You can't clean out your basement if you don't have hot water. This is a crisis. This is a public health crisis, and as you heard, it's only going to get worse if we don't clean it up.
That's right.
Ford said he plans to reach out to the governor's office for support, as well as calling on community organizations and volunteers to assist with cleanup and repairs. And we're going to have much more on the flooding in just a few seconds. But first, all aboard the commuter rail to Rockford.
Metro announces today it'll reinstate service between Chicago and Rockford starting in 2027. That would be the first time commuter rail existed between the two cities since 1981. Metro says it'll offer twice daily round-trip service on its Milwaukee District West line that currently runs to Elgin. The trip is expected to take about 95 minutes.
All right, and coming up in the program, as we mentioned, how Chicago handles major flooding.
But first, we dive into Mayor Johnson's transition report. Heather Sharon joins us right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Nearly 2 months after taking office, Mayor Brandon Johnson now has a blueprint to guide his push to make Chicago a more just and vibrant city for everyone. Crafted by Johnson's transition committee, the report endorses the progressive agenda laid out by Johnson during the campaign to tackle Chicago's deep-seated woes.
We know Chicago has problems, and we live in troubled times in a bitterly divided nation. But hope is ascendant. We recommit ourselves today to working with Mayor Johnson in fighting for the soul of this city and building bridges required to realize a more just and radically inclusive Chicago.
And WTTW News reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more. So Heather, this report is 233 pages long, was compiled by approximately 400 people. You're not going to read us the whole thing. Give us the highlights.
I am not. Well, as you said, it dovetails with much of the campaign that Brandon Johnson waged this spring. It endorses his call to reopen the mental health clinic in phases. It also endorses his plan to take a new holistic approach to public safety, one that centers victims as opposed to perpetrators or the police. It also endorses his call to hire 200 more detectives or to promote 200 more detectives. That report does not emphasize filling the nearly 1,000 vacancies in the police department, emblematic of the new approach that Johnson has promised to take.
Now, in a brief speech, Johnson addressed criticism that this report is overdue, coming nearly 2 months after he took office. Take a look.
Now, for those who are asking why it took so long, I don't think it needs an explanation. But it's because people of Chicago are worth the time, the effort, and the deliberation to finally get it right. We have to get it right for no one else but for our young people.
Former mayors Rahm Emanuel and Lori Lightfoot, they released their transition reports before they took office. Why did Johnson do it differently?
Well, Johnson took office after the shortest mayoral transition in history, just 41 days. And you'll remember the runoff that he won was much more contested than either Rahm Emanuel's first election or Lori Lightfoot's only election. So he was behind the 8 ball to begin with. But as you heard him say, it was important to him that this was a truly collaborative process that brought in as many people as possible, and that gives us a little bit of a glimpse into how he intends to govern Chicago.
400 people is plenty. Now, Johnson described this report as a culmination of a decades-long effort to make Chicago a more equitable place to live. What does that tell us about how Johnson plans to govern over the next 4 years?
Well, we've heard him say several times in the last couple of weeks that he is not a dictator. He sees his role as mayor as essentially an organizer-in-chief, to bring people together, to figure out the best way forward, and then to implement those plans. This transition report is essentially a blueprint to do just that. And he made a point of acknowledging that many of the people who were on stage behind him today and who helped create this report were people who protested Lori Lightfoot, who protested Rahm Emanuel, and in some cases were arrested on the 5th floor of City Hall, where his office now sits.
Okay, Heather Sharon, thanks so much.
Thanks, Brandis.
And you can read Heather's full story on our website. It's all at WTTW.com/news. Paris.
Brandis, after months of drought, the Chicago area has been deluged with buckets of rain over the last several days. As much as 8 inches fell in certain parts over the weekend, followed by major flooding. And last night, Chicagoans saw around 2. Here to tell us how exactly all that stormwater is managed and what went into the decision to open the locks to let it flow into Lake Michigan is Kevin Fitzpatrick, Assistant Director of Engineering with the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. Kevin, thanks for joining us. So very simply, remind our viewers where all that billions and billions of gallons of rainwater and stormwater goes after a storm like this.
Well, eventually it's captured either in our deep tunnel system or it's treated at our wastewater treatment plant. And then after the storm, we do pump it back and clean it before it goes out to the waterways, eventually flowing south towards the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico.
And how taxed has the system been this week?
As taxed as it can be. We completely filled up our McCook Reservoir, which is 3.5 billion gallons of water. We've completely filled our deep tunnel, which is 2.4 billion gallons of water, and our Stickney plant is running at full capacity. It's one of the largest treatment plants in the world. So we caught a lot of rain, and we're still catching up.
And you're sitting in your car right now because, as I understand, you're on your way to a community meeting in Austin. The West Side, areas of the West Side, Cicero seem to have the worst localized flooding. Why was it so bad there, and how have conditions improved?
Yeah, it's just, we've seen this lately in these weather patterns. It was sort of, they call it a microburst, or where the rainstorm really just sat in this area. And in general, Chicago got about 3 to 4 inches, but Cicero, the west side of Chicago, they measured 8.9 inches of rain over 12 hours on Sunday. And combined with a little bit of rain before and a little rain after, It's unprecedented amounts, and it's something that's very difficult to deal with.
8.9 inches, that is an amazing amount over 12 hours. And I know the decision to open the locks to reverse the flow of the river out into Lake Michigan, both in Chicago and then in Wilmette, it's a very difficult decision. Remind us what goes into that.
Yeah, certainly we try to minimize any amount of reversal of the river back into the lake, which is the way it originally went, because it does bring polluted water into the lake, which is our drinking water source. So we try and avoid it at all costs. However, we recognize that if we if we have these storms that bring, 5 to 8 inches of water, they're going to fill our waterways and overflow them and cause tremendous amounts of flooding, even more than we see already. So once the river gets above the lake level, then we can sort of open up those locks and relieve it to the lake so that it doesn't continue to rise any further.
And you mentioned those reservoirs. Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
I was just going to say, some people ask us, can we do it a little sooner and avoid the flooding altogether? And we really can't, because we got to wait till the river gets above the lake level to allow it to flow in that direction. If we opened it too soon, the lake would come into the river and it would only exacerbate the problems.
And I know, again, a difficult decision because Lake Michigan is our drinking water and folks obviously recreate and swim in the lake. How dangerous does it make the water, and for how long?
Well, it brings human waste and other things that are in the river. Fortunately, the river is a lot cleaner than it's been in the past, but when we have storms, this whole city of Chicago and 50 of the suburbs have combined sewers. So, our domestic sewage mixes with this stormwater. So it's not only stormwater going out there, but also sewage. So it makes it can make it very difficult and potentially dangerous to swim in, which is why the city gives beach advisories, and Evanston is given a beach advisory. And it usually takes a couple of days for that bacteria to die off on its own. It doesn't like to be out in the environment. It likes to be in people's bodies. So eventually it dies off and the lake will be safe again.
And you mentioned the deep tunnels and the reservoirs. If anyone's driven by those reservoirs, the quarries, they're huge, and you say they were pretty much full. Is the system built to withstand much more than what we've received? And if not, then what happens?
Well, currently the system, the Stickney McCook Reservoir system fills probably once or twice a year. We are expanding it, though, is the good news. It's the reservoir itself, it's enormous, but it's 3.5 billion gallons, and we're building another cell that's going to add another 6.5 billion gallons. So eventually we will have more storage. But I caution, even when we do have that additional storage, the water still has to get to us, right? And these sewers that were built in Chicago and some of the suburbs, they're 100 years old or so. They weren't made for the storms that we see today. Most sewer systems are built for a 5-year storm, and the one we saw in Cicero was somewhere between 100 to 500-year storm.
Wait, very quickly, what do you mean when you say that, 100 to 500-year storm?
So a 100-year storm has a 1% chance of occurring each year. Theoretically, it should only happen once every 100 years at a particular location. And a 500-year storm is even larger. It should only happen once in every 500 years, which is a 0.2% chance of happening.
That's amazing. And with climate change,
we are getting a lot bigger storms. Yeah, climate change, we're getting these storms. They're occurring more frequently. 100-year storms are more like 10-year storms.
And Kevin, like I'm sorry, we have to wrap there, but I was going to say with climate change, this might become more of a commonality. And we might have to have you on more to talk about this. Best of luck. Thanks very much for joining us.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Paris.
And we're back with more Chicago Tonight right after this.
Where have we been? Where are we at? Where are we going?
Essentially to be able to help anyone and everyone in the community, whether that's through academic support, social emotional learning, or just providing a safe space for youth to be able to be there.
This is the fabric of the neighborhood. You need to take care of the neighborhood. It's an ecosystem.
Two former employees of a business in West Suburban Aurora say they were stiffed out of weeks of pay. Now they're speaking out, despite the well-connected owner. In recent weeks, WTTW News has reported on the company owned by Aurora Mayor Richard Irvin's girlfriend. The City Council approved a $10,000 grant to Laura Ayala Clark's furniture business in May, despite that potential conflict of interest. And Ayala Clark's company misrepresented whether it had gotten COVID relief funding in the grant application. Now, two people who say they worked for Laura's Furniture are claiming they weren't paid as promised, and more. Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg is here with the story. Nick.
Well, Brandis, Natalie Offen and Nicholas Rodriguez say they first met Aurora Mayor Richard Irvin late last year when they invited him to a restaurant that Rodriguez was promoting on TikTok. They told me later on Ayala Clark joined them, and the next day Offen went to the furniture store to do Ayala Clark's lashes. That's what Offen did for work at the time. But they say pretty quickly the talk turned to Ayala Clark looking for help at the store and beyond.
She basically sold us the dream, saying that she was looking for people to run her store and then eventually partner with her in opening another store, and basically owning a furniture store, being able to bring our daughter to work the way that she brought her children to work.
Offen and Rodriguez say they made a verbal agreement they'd each be paid $500 a week plus commission on anything they sold.
So Nick, how did the relationship sour?
Well, they told me that despite filling out all the paperwork to get on payroll, they weren't paid the first week. The second week, they said Ayala Clark paid Offen $500 and Rodriguez just $250 with a transfer via Zelle from what they say was a personal account, and that was all they ever got despite working full-time at the store for about a month. Offen sent me extensive text message records asking for weeks when they'd get paid. They appear to show Ayala Clark repeatedly putting them off and eventually responding angrily before telling them to drop their key off and stop coming in.
It was around Christmas time. We didn't get everything we wanted to get for our daughter. It was around the time for rent. I reached out to her and let her know that my landlord was going to charge me a late fee and things like that, and she just did not seem to care.
Offen also showed me messages she sent to Irvin asking about the issue. They appear to show the mayor saying that as mayor, he has too much on his plate to get involved.
So then after they stopped working at the store, were Offen and Rodriguez paid?
No, they tell me they still haven't been, and they said the same thing to the State Department of Labor. A spokesperson told me the department can't comment because it's an open and active investigation. Through a public records request, we obtained a subpoena sent to Laura Ayala Clark asking for a variety of records relating to Offen and Rodriguez's employment. We also learned from state records that there's currently a nearly $49,000 lien against the company for taxes the state says she owes, which Offen and Rodriguez said there was a notice of posted on the door of the store one day when they showed up for work. They also allege that there were customer complaints from people who said furniture was late, damaged, or that the quoted price kept changing.
While we were working there, we seen so many angry people saying that they never received the furniture they paid for, people waiting like months for their things.
Several people also complained on a public Facebook post Offen made about her time working at Laura's Furniture. The company has an F rating on the Better Business Bureau website with several complaints and negative reviews.
I feel like nobody wants to stand up in the community because she's dating the mayor, and they're feared because of the power he has politically.
It's not only just about our payment, but it's also, again, like justice for everyone that was negatively affected by this.
I spoke with Ayala Clark briefly on the phone yesterday, who said she could not comment and that her attorney was handling everything. But she said any claims Offen and Rodriguez make about her or her business are simply not true. We should add that payments from that City of Aurora grant program we've been reporting on are being delayed. City staff say it's due to missing documentation from several companies involved and that all the applications are under review. Brandis.
Okay, Nick, great reporting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, Tommy, can you hear me? But first, a look at the weather. Stay with us.
What were you doing at the age of 23? The Who's Pete Townsend was composing Tommy, the band's groundbreaking 1969 rock opera. Tommy tells the story of a traumatized boy who shuts down his senses. Though deaf, dumb, and blind, he grows up to become a pinball wizard and a messianic figure. Back in 1993, the musical version of Tommy won 5 Tony Awards, including 1 for the director. Now that director is reimagining the stage production with input from Pete Townsend. Producer Mark Vitale has the story from the Goodman Theatre.
At a mini arcade in the lobby, an actor plays pinball before rehearsal. He portrays Tommy Walker, a role made famous by The Who's Roger Daltrey in concert and on film.
Coming into it, it felt like this sort of big weight on my shoulders, just in the idea that this is such an iconic piece in the world of rock and roll and film and on the stage. You know, I came into that with all of that and trying to see, like, all right, how can I bring myself into this? No matter what role you do, you know, you bring a little part of yourself too, so I knew that wouldn't be too much of a problem, but I just made sure to go back into all the archives. I watched every Who performance I could find.
Soon after the album was released, The Who played a suite of Tommy songs at Woodstock. In the 1970s, Tommy was made into an extravagant film by director Ken Russell. And then a Tony Award-winning rock musical in 1993. It's a project that has never gone away in the 55 years since Pete Townsend wrote it.
I think you use those projects as a lens to understand your own life and times. Pete and I visited a couple of years ago, right before COVID, and talked about this, and he and I agreed that the world, in a sense, has caught up with Tommy Walker. You know, everybody's walking around staring into a mirror. And there is a tendency, I think, for people to want to escape inside themselves.
After COVID, they teamed with Goodman Theatre for months of casting calls and rehearsals. The new production is a sensory explosion and puts an emphasis on movement and modern dance.
I just listened to the music over and over again and started imagining how I would dance to it. The challenge is to make sure you're not over choreographing because we're telling a story. And, you know, there's a person at the center of it that is sort of standing still.
We get to see this character that has shunned the world and existence and sort of has gone internal, which is a really cool thing for me to have played with and sort of figured out what that meant for me and my body, and like understanding touch and vibration being the most heightened state.
It's the most exhilarating music, and you're dancing all night long. And inside of that, there's this very profound story about a family.
Tommy rejects existence as we know it. Tommy is the anti-hero ground zero. Pete's talked a lot about the parallels with his generation and Generation Z and kind of their attempt to redefine values, and also, I think, encourage a kind of human understanding of others, perhaps sensitivity and generosity. We have to be more generous to each other.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
I saw it. It was amazing. It's officially called The Who's Tommy, the musical. It's on stage at Goodman Theatre through August 6th. And now, Brandis, back to you.
Ringing endorsement from Paris Schutz. Chicago has seen more than 10,000 migrants arrive since last fall. But so far, city officials say not enough federal support has been given to help the migrants get settled. Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia sat down with us on Chicago Tonight Latino Voices. Here's a sneak peek of that conversation, beginning with Garcia's assessment on the current migrant situation.
I think Mayor Brandon Johnson is taking the right position and maintaining the history and the legacy of being a welcoming city for immigrants from all over. The city hasn't received enough funding. There's money needed for food, for shelter and other support services, mental health services. We're working in Washington to get more aid to Chicago from FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency, It is needed and warranted, and Chicago isn't alone. Other cities are impacted by this, cities like New York, as you know.
Right, and California as well. They're getting also more migrants right now, so they're dealing with that as well. But what can Illinois representatives like yourself be doing to get the support from the federal government?
We're urging the White House to act. We're urging them to get FEMA to recognize the extraordinary circumstances and to respond. In addition to that, I am leading a letter with over 20 signatories of my colleagues to the White House this week, asking the president to extend employment authorization not just to the recent arrivals, but to others who have been here in many instances in Chicagoland for decades. Right. If people have the ability to work at a time when the economy is begging for additional workers, it advances our economic interests. It's good for the migrants, and it's less of a burden on government, including local, state, and federal government.
And you can watch that full conversation tomorrow night at 5:30 on Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices.
That's our show for this Thursday night. And now for all of us at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.